One stray, one woman, and the herd he'd sworn was gone forever. The stray walked out of the arroyo at first light, and I almost shot it. Not because I was angry. I was past angry by then. I nearly shot it because I didn't want anything again, and a lone steer standing in the frost at the edge of my ruined land was the kind of thing a man could start to want. Start to hope around. I knew better. 3 years of knowing better, and here was this red and white brindled fool, ribs showing, one horn broke off at the base, standing in the sage like he'd always planned to be there. Like he was waiting for someone to come out and acknowledge that he'd arrived. I lowered the rifle. I don't know why. Maybe I was just tired of the sound of things dying. His brand told me something. When I got close enough to read it, a rocking D iron on his left hip, faded under the winter coat but clear once you knew what to look for, I felt something stir in my chest that I hadn't expected. Something old and particular. That brand had been off the range for a decade. The Callaway outfit had dissolved back in '89, when old Denton Callaway died intestate and his 3 sons wanted the cash more than the land. They sold fast to a buyer from the east who wanted acreage for reasons that had nothing to do with cattle. The herd scattered east into the breaks when the Callaways left, not rounded up and sold, just scattered. Let go. Nobody gathered them. The buyer didn't care, and the Callaways were already gone, and the price on beef that year didn't justify the effort. Those cattle just became part of the country. Part of the high country talk. The Rocking D ghost herd. People called them in saloons when they needed something to say on a cold evening. Though not quite seriously. The way men name things they've decided aren't real so they don't have to think too hard about what happened to them. I had told that story myself, years back. Younger, with a working outfit and no reason to think about feral herds in somebody else's high country. I put the rifle back in the scabbard, walked out to the steer in the cold. He let me come. Not tame at all, but something in between tame and wild, in that middle country where an animal that has survived alone will still sometimes allow a person close enough if they come slowly and don't push. I got within 3 feet and stopped. He shifted 1 foot but didn't move off. I put my hand on his neck, on the muscle there under the winter coat, and felt the live heat of him, the weight of a large animal that has sustained itself through conditions that should have finished it. A decade in the high breaks. The winters up there are serious. Whatever this steer was, he wasn't what he looked like at first glance, broken down, starved out, lucky to be standing. He was a thing that had kept itself alive by knowing something, and the knowing was still in him. I stood there with my hand on that steer's neck longer than I'd have admitted to anyone. "All right," I said. The horses were in the barn, nobody to hear it but the steer and the sage. "All right. My name is Callum Hart. I turned 61 that November. I had run cattle on this land for 22 years before things came apart, and I had been putting off deciding what to do about that long enough that the question was starting to answer itself without me. I am going to tell this the way it actually was. Not the version a man arranges to sound better than he is. The real version, which means starting with what I had been, in the 3 years before the steer walked out of the arroyo. I had been stopping. Not all at once. That would have been easier, a decision you could look at and understand. It was piece by piece, the way a fence goes down in hard country. A post here, a wire there, and one morning you walk out and what you thought was a fence is just a memory of one. The blizzard of '90 took my south pasture herd in 2 days. Came in from the northwest in November with that particular violence that the high plains produces when the conditions align. Fast enough that I couldn't move the cattle to shelter. Cold enough that even the ones that found windbreaks didn't all make it. 42 head. The 12 survivors I sold because I couldn't carry them through the winter on what I had left, and selling them was painful, but watching them die would have been worse. The money from the sale went affixing the east well casing, which had cracked somewhere in the freeze and let the surface water into the shaft. Bad water. Not enough to kill a man immediately, but enough to make you sick and enough to be useless for stock. Fixing it right cost me what I'd gotten for the cattle. Then the knee. A horse fall from 15 years prior, a thing I'd managed so long it had become part of the background, like a door that sticks in winter. You learn to lift and push, you stop thinking about it. The winter after the blizzard, it stopped being background. I spent 3 months moving carefully from one piece of furniture to the next, doing the minimum necessary, burning through what energy I had on the basic business of getting through the day. No hired hand by then. No family on the place. My wife had been gone 12 years, and my sons, I have two grown with their own lives and their own distances, had offered to come, and I had told them not to, which was not wisdom but pride, and I knew the difference between those two things even then. I just chose pride. I told myself I was resting, that I'd start again come fall. Fall came and I told myself spring. You know how that goes or you don't, and if you don't, I cannot explain it to you in a way that will feel real. What I can tell you is what it is from the inside, quiet. A particular quality of quiet that gets into everything. Into the walls of the house, into the sound of your boots on the floor in the morning, into the tools hanging in the barn that you are not using. It is not peaceful, that quiet. It has a different quality than peace. It has a weight to it, an accumulating weight, and the thing about accumulating weight is that after enough time, you stop being aware of carrying it. It just becomes what you weigh. What I weighed by that November was considerable. Here is one concrete accounting of it, because I think it deserves to be said plainly rather than gestured at. On the morning Nora Vess arrived, I had not ridden to the back of my property in 14 months. Not for any reason of injury or weather. I simply had not done it. The back fence, the long fence that ran along the creek bottom and up the far ridge, I had not checked in over a year, and I knew it was in poor shape and I had not gone. I had 22 years of habit, that said. Check that fence, and I had overcome all of it and stayed near the house instead, which required no small amount of effort that I was applying, without noticing, in the direction of not doing things. That is what going smaller looks like from inside it. Not dramatic, not a man sitting in the dark weeping for what he'd lost, just a man who has gradually reduced the circle of what he engages with month by month, until the circle has gotten quite small and he has grown accustomed to the size of it and has found ways to explain the size to himself. The fence needs checking, but the knee is bad today. The lease land on the east side needs a ride-through, but the weather is turning. The well needs looking at, but I'll need to get a man in for that, and it can wait a week. Each reason is plausible. None of them individually is a lie. Together, they add up to a man who stopped. Into the accumulated quiet of 3 years of stopping, Nora Vess arrived. She came on a Tuesday in late October, the same week I found the steer. I had just come back from the barn, where I'd been doing the minimum, when her wagon came up the lane. A gray mule she drove well, not fighting it, not coddling it, in clear agreement with it the way a good teamster is. She had a boy with her on the seat, maybe 14, long in the leg and quiet in the face, who jumped down from the wagon before it had quite stopped and went to the mule's head without being asked. She herself climbed down holding a basket and walked toward me in a direct line, like a person, arriving somewhere they'd planned to arrive. She was maybe 50, dark hair going silver at the front, worn back tight under a plain hat, a face that had done time in weather and had reached something you might call settled with it, not worn down, just shaped by it, the way good leather gets shaped by use. She wore a coat that had been expensive once, some years back. The wool and the cut told you that. Now it was just warm, repaired at both elbows with different colored thread. Her boots were worn but oiled. She had taken care of things. "Mr. Hart," she said, not a question. "That's right. Nora Vess. I filed on the Carver parcel 2 months ago." She looked at the barn, the house, the fence line, the way someone who knows land actually looks at land. Not the tourist's admiring sweep, and not the banker's measuring skepticism. Something in between, neutral and complete, assessment, taking in what was there. "The land office told me you'd be my nearest neighbor, which I expect makes us neighbors whether we decide to be or not." I hadn't had a nearest neighbor in a while. The Carver place had been empty 6 years, since Frank Carver moved to his son's place in Colorado and didn't come back, and 6 years of empty had become the comfortable new normal. A neighbor was a thing with implications. Reciprocal watching, the expectation of help in hard weather, the social fact of proximity. I was not certain I was ready for implications. But she was standing in my yard looking at me with those level gray eyes, and she was not performing any expectation. She was just there. "I need a month's use of your south pasture," she said. She said it like a woman who has thought through what she needs and has come directly to the relevant party, not working up to it, not softening it, not framing it as a favor she could be refused. A straightforward, practical ask between people who are going to be neighbors whether they decide to be or not. Something about the directness of it cut through the thick layer of caution I'd been carrying and found the sensible man underneath it. "I have 40 head coming up from the valley, and I need somewhere to hold them while I get my fences set. I'll pay you in fence work my boy and I can work." She glanced at the east fence line, the way she'd glanced at everything else, assessed it, filed it. "I can see you've got wire down along your east line." The east fence was down in 3 places, had been down since spring. I had been going to fix it. I had been going to do a number of things. "What stock?" "Shorthorns mostly, a few crosses, good animals, they've been well kept." "Your own?" "My own, clear title." She said this with a particular flatness that told me the question of title had not always been simple, and that she had made it simple through her own effort, and she wanted that understood. I looked at the south pasture. It was in worse shape than it had been. But the grass was there, good grass actually, because the season had been wet and nothing had grazed it, and it had done what grass does when left alone, which is grow. Nobody had told the grass to stop. The grass had not noticed that anything was wrong. "Month," I said. "Month," she said, "and the fence work." She didn't thank me. There was no performance of gratitude. She acknowledged the agreement and moved on, which I noticed because it was different from how most people received something they needed. Most people will gratitude you slightly to death, as a way of establishing the debt and their awareness of it. She just took it as the beginning of a practical arrangement between neighboring people with a mutual need. I found it almost physically relieving. She set up in the old line shack at the edge of the south pasture, which had a sound roof and a wood stove and nothing else anyone would have called comfortable, but which she and the boy, Emmett, his name was, Emmett Vess, had functional inside of 2 days. They cleaned it, restacked the firewood, chinked 2 gaps in the wall where the wind came through. The cattle arrived 4 days later, driven up by a hired man from the valley who delivered them and left the same afternoon, his part done. Nora and Emmett handled the gather and the move into the pasture themselves, and I watched from the fence because I had walked out there without quite making the decision to. She didn't ask for help. That was what kept me at the fence. I have spent enough of my life around people working to know the difference between someone who manages their work and someone who is managing you while working. Nora Vess managed her work. She moved through those cattle with the ease of someone who has been doing this since before she could name what she was doing, reading animals, placing herself, using her body and the boy's body as 2 points of a shifting geometry that directed the cattle without forcing them. Emmett healed well, turned them when he needed to, and didn't get ambitious about it. They spoke occasionally, but not much, having developed a shorthand that comes from working together in close quarters through situations that required quick agreement and no waste. They had 40 head in the south pasture in an hour and 40 minutes, which was good time. I went back to the house. I fixed the east fence that week. Nobody asked me to. I just found myself out there 2 mornings running with wire pliers and new staples, and by the end of the 2nd day, there was a tight 1/4 mile where there had been sag and gap. I want to be accurate about this. It did not feel like a decision. It felt like what happens on a clear weather morning when the knee is cooperating, and there is something visible and useful in front of you. The steer I penned in the small lot by the barn, got him on hay and water, watched the ribs recede under a better coat of flesh over the following weeks. He put on weight fast, the way animals do when they've been running a deficit fast and efficient, the body catching up to itself. I checked his feet and his teeth and listened to his lungs, and he was sound. Old. 6 or 7 years, maybe 8, which meant he'd been born in the breaks, one of the first generation of feral calves, which meant there was a breeding population up there, which meant the ghost herd was not just surviving but perpetuating itself. He was a calmer animal than he should have been, given 10 years without human contact, and I found myself thinking about that. Thinking about what the high breaks do to an animal over time, how a creature that has survived long enough in hard country, without protection or supplemental feed, without a man to pull it out of trouble, develops a different quality than stock that has been handled its whole life. Something that isn't tameness but isn't pure fear either. Something more like assessment. This steer had walked out of the arroyo and looked at me and made a calculation, and the calculation had come down in my favor, and he had stood his ground. I respected that. I found I respected it quite a lot. The Rocking brand came back to me in the evenings. I was not accustomed to the evenings anymore, not accustomed to having thoughts in them, to using them for anything but eating and the minimum end-of-day maintenance. But the brand kept coming. I would sit in the kitchen with the lamp turned low, and I would think about the high country to the east, the drainages I knew by name and by feel, the grass bowls on the south-facing slopes that held heat longer than the exposed ridgelines and stayed unfrozen past the first hard frosts, the seeps that ran year-round in the places where the rock tilted just right. I had ridden that country many times over 22 years. I knew where a herd could have held together if it had the intelligence to find the good ground. Cattle have more of that intelligence than most people credit them for. These cattle had clearly had enough. The particular quality of what I was thinking in those evenings was new. I was thinking about going somewhere, about going there for a reason, with a purpose, with a probable outcome. I had not thought that way in 3 years. In 3 years I had not made a plan that extended more than a week into the future, because planning requires believing that the future will hold something worth planning for, and I had, without quite acknowledging it, which is the coward's way of doing things, stopped believing that. I was thinking about it less idly now. I was thinking about it with something that had edges to it, something that was close to intention. The particular quality of what I was thinking was this: going up there. Riding into that country in November with the passes closing and the cold coming, looking for a feral herd that everyone had filed under story and moved on from. I had not thought about going somewhere specific for a long time. The idea had a texture to it that I was trying not to examine too closely because examining it would have forced a decision, and I was not yet certain I was capable of making one. Nora came to the barn one morning to look at the steer. She stood at the lot fence with her forearms on the top rail and studied him for a good while without speaking. That was a thing I had already noticed about her. She would look at something seriously before she spoke about it, which meant when she did speak, she was usually saying the actual thing and not a preliminary version of it. "Rocking," she said. "Callaway iron, they dissolved in '89. I've heard of the Callaway herd." She looked at the steer's feet, his conformation, the way his weight was distributed, practical. The ghost herd story, we had it in the valley too. Everybody had it. You believe it? I was quiet for a moment. The steer pulled hay with a long, slow sweep of his tongue. "I didn't used to," I said. She turned and looked at me. Just looked, the way she did, steady and without agenda. "The passes close in 6 weeks, I said. "If there's a herd in the breaks, this time of year they'd be moving to the lower drainages. The cold pushes them down before the snow gets deep on the high grass. They'd be findable this time of year by someone who knows that country." "Do you know that country?" "I know it well enough." She was quiet. A horse moved in the barn. The wind was out of the north, which meant change. "You thinking about going up?" she said. The thing I noticed about that question was that it had no lean to it, no encouragement and no skepticism. Just, "Is that what you're thinking?" She was taking a reading the way she took readings on everything. Maybe, I said. She nodded, acknowledging, not endorsing, and went back to work. Emmett brought me the next piece of evidence 3 days later. He'd been riding the fence line on the east side, which I'd put him on without explaining too carefully why I was directing a boy who wasn't mine to do work on my property, when he came back with a piece of hide on a stick. Brindle pattern, red and white. He'd found a kill site at the base of the ridge. A lion had taken a young one sometime in the previous 2 weeks. The carcass was well into decomposition, but the hide, at the edges away from the kill site, was intact enough to read the pattern. He'd cut a piece and brought it back because, he said, he thought I'd want it. That was good thinking. I told him so plainly. He received it the way he received most things, without visible reaction, filed, moved on. I spread the hide piece on the workbench and looked at it. Rocking brindle, as clear as the brand on my penned steer. They were at the base of the ridge. They were already coming down. The lion's kill was a natural consequence of that, a young one, not yet wise to predator pressure at the lower elevation, making itself available. The herd was moving, and they were moving toward me. I sat with that for a day and a half. What I was sitting with, and I want to be clear about this because I think it is the real center of what this story is about, was whether I was going to let it matter. The cattle were there. The evidence was plain. Going up to find them meant committing to an outcome, which meant risking the particular humiliation of a 61-year-old man with a bad knee, and 3 years of going smaller riding into hard mountain country after a ghost herd, and coming back with nothing. For 3 years I had organized my life very carefully to eliminate that kind of risk. To stay within what I knew wouldn't hurt me anymore, which had become a fairly small territory, and which was getting smaller all the time, in exactly the way Nora had described, though she hadn't said it yet. The line shack had a light in it that evening. I could see the yellow of it from the kitchen window, small and steady in the dark. I stood there and looked at it longer than made any practical sense. Then I went to the barn, got out the saddle I hadn't used in 11 months, and looked at the leather. The leather needed oiling, both coats. I was working through the first coat when Nora came in, not late but the full dark already down. She came through the barn door in her coat with her hands in the pockets and didn't say anything about the hour or the fact that I was sitting in a barn with a saddle I hadn't touched in the better part of a year. She sat down on the tack box across from me and was quiet. The oil rag made a sound going across the leather. The horses breathed in their stalls. Outside, the wind was building from the north the way it builds before it brings something. "My husband died 4 years ago," she said. She said it flat, the way she said most things, a fact placed between us where we could both look at it. "I'm sorry," I said. "Thank you." She was quiet a moment, her eyes on the middle distance. The place we had in the valley was his family's land, and it turned out to be his family's debt as well, which I hadn't known the full weight of until he was gone. They took the land for the debt, and that's fair enough by the law, but they took it 6 days after he died. She smoothed her coat over her knees with both hands, a thing she did sometimes when settling into a long thought. I had Emmett and $60. I had the cattle my husband had bought that summer, which they couldn't touch because he'd put them in my name some months before he died. I've wondered since if he knew. I think he might have known. She paused. It took me 3 years of very particular, very careful work to get from $60 and 40 head to where I am now, filing on the Carver parcel, fences to put up. I worked the oil into the leather and listened. "I am telling you this," she said, "because you look like a man who has talked himself out of something and is trying not to notice that he's done it. I know that look. I wore it for 6 months after my husband died, when I had Emmett and $60, and I couldn't see any way through that didn't require becoming someone I didn't know how to be. It is a very particular look. It is the look of someone who is making themselves smaller so the thing they're afraid of can't find them." I set the oil rag down and looked at her. "How does it end?" I said. "The making yourself smaller." You already know how it ends, she said. You just want to hear it from someone outside. I waited. It ends with a man who doesn't do things anymore, she said. That's all. No drama. Just one morning you realize you're not a man with a problem you haven't solved. You're a man who has stopped solving problems. That's not the same thing. It's much worse. The wind hit the barn roof, and the boards ticked and settled. One of the horses moved against the stall boards with a long, slow lean. I'm 61 years old, I said. I know how old you are. This knee. I know about the knee. She stood up, not angry, just finished with that portion, done with the argument she was refusing to have. She looked at the saddle on the stand, the oil and the rag, my hands. You'll want a second coat on the skirt, she said, and went back to the line shack. I sat there in the quiet with the horses and the wind for a long time after, not thinking exactly, or thinking the way you think when the thinking has already been done and you're just waiting for yourself to catch up to it. The steer in the lot, the hide piece on the workbench, the light in the lower drainage, moving down before the cold. Then I did the second coat on the skirt. I left Thursday before the light came. Emmett rode with me. Nora had arranged this without a discussion, stated it simply. The boy would go, he could ride. If the knee gave out in bad country, I'd need someone who could move fast for help. I did not argue because she was right, and because arguing with a right thing felt like a waste of the morning. I had 2 horses, a pack mule borrowed from Nora's string, supplies for 4 days, rope, and an extra branding iron that I dug out of the barn and brought along more out of a feeling that I should be prepared than any conviction that I'd need it. We went up through the timber at a walk, through a cold that had a smell, old snow and pine resin and high air, the particular emptiness of elevation, the way the world gets quiet and specific and serious the higher you go. The light came back slowly, gray first, then the flat cold gold of a November morning, long shadows on the snow and the timber, the peaks to the east going pink above the tree line. My knee ached from the first mile and did not stop. I rode through it. I want to note that and move on. It hurt and I rode through it, and that was the fact of it, and I did not perform stoicism about it because there was no one watching and no point. Emmett was a good hand in the mountains. He rode the way mountain riding requires, adjusting to the terrain, not fighting it, letting the horse do the work it was built to do and applying the minimum of correction. He watched the ridgelines and the draws with the attention you need up there, where a shift in wind or a change in the light can tell you something if you're paying attention. He did not talk much. This is a virtue at 14 in that country that many men twice his age have not developed. I noticed it and said nothing. We worked the lower drainages the first day. The places where cattle moved when they were pushed down by weather, the protected draws, the south-facing slopes that held grass later, the willow bends where a seep kept the ground soft enough to graze even after the upper country froze. We found sign in the afternoon, tracks in soft ground near a seep, a tangle of winter hair on a willow branch at the height a cow's neck would pass, and then in the late light, a fresh scatter of manure in a wide flat between 2 timber stands. Maybe 2 days old. We were behind them but not far. We made camp in a stand of timber on the north shoulder of a ridge, good shelter from the wind. Emmett built the fire without making a production of it, small and efficient, enough for heat and coffee and to cook on. We ate salt pork and biscuits that Nora had packed, which were better than they needed to be for a camp supply. I noticed that. The boy noticed me notice that and looked away. We drank coffee from the same battered pot, and after a while I asked him how he'd learned to work cattle the way he did, because I was genuinely curious, and because he was the kind of boy who deserved a direct question more than the careful dance adults usually do around kids, acting like they're not there or not worth asking. He thought about it. He had his mother's habit of taking a question seriously before he answered it. My father, he said, before he got sick. He was a stockman. Good one, he knew what cattle were thinking. He looked at the fire. He used to say they were always telling you something, you just had to be quiet enough to hear it. We were quiet for a while. He was right about that, I said. Emmett nodded and drank his coffee. The sky was clear, and the temperature dropped sharply after dark, the kind of cold that is honest about itself. No wind to make it worse and no cloud to hold the warmth in, just open sky, and stars going hard and bright above the timber, and the temperature falling with a purpose. The horses stood by the picket line breathing plumes into the dark. I banked the fire and lay in my bedroll with my hat over my face, and stared at the inside of the hat, and listened to the mountain be quiet. I thought about the 22 years I'd been in this country, what I'd built in those years, and what I'd let deteriorate, and what had been taken, and what I had given away without quite noticing I was giving it. Whether a man at 61 with a knee that swelled up after 12 miles of mountain riding was truly too late for certain things, or whether that was a story you told yourself because it was more comfortable than the alternative. The alternative being, you were not too late, there was time and capability remaining. And you would have to decide what to do with that, which was a harder thing than it sounded, because having nothing left to risk is simple in its way. Having something left to risk is complicated. I thought about Nora Vess saying, you get smaller. Every year you don't, you get smaller. I thought about the saddle oil on my hands, the second coat on the skirt. Emmett found them the next morning. He was 20 yards ahead of me on the ridge, and he pulled up and raised his hand without turning around, the signal for stop, quiet, and I stopped and was quiet. He sat his horse for a moment, looking down the far side of the ridge, and then he pointed. Below us, in a wide draw where an old creek bent through willows and dry November grass, the land was moving. Not all at once, moving the way cattle move when they are comfortable, spread and slow, heads down in the frost, the quiet, purposeful grazing of animals that have found good ground and settled into it. I sat my horse on the ridge and counted, got to 35 before they shifted into the timber, started again. Emmett said very quietly without taking his eyes off them, more in the trees. Red and white brindle, most of them. A few darker ones, crosses from whatever had wandered into their territory over 10 years. But the brindle was the Callaway brindle, the particular pattern I'd learned from the steer in the lot, and on every animal I could get a clear look at, the left hip showed the rocking the iron. The ghost herd. I sat on that ridge for a while. I am not going to be elaborate about what that felt like. I will tell you this. I had ridden up into that country in November on a bad knee at 61 years old, and there had been, in the back of my mind, the clear possibility that there was nothing to find, that the steer and the hide piece were strays or coincidence, and the ghost herd was what it had always been, which was a story. That possibility had been present in every mile of the ride. You cannot be honest about going somewhere in search of something without acknowledging the possibility of nothing, and I had found something. Emmett had the grace to look at the cattle and not at me. After a while I said, "We'll need to be slow about this." He said, "Yes, sir." We spent 2.5 days getting them down. Feral cattle have long memories for pressure and no patience for being hurried, and the temptation, when you want something badly, and you're 2 days from home and your knee is saying things that don't belong in polite company, is to push. I did not push. I have made enough expensive mistakes from pushing to know what it costs. We moved them low and steady and patient, showing direction rather than force, being predictable so the animals could make their own decision to go the way we wanted. Emmett understood this without being told. He had a quality of patience in the saddle that most grown men spend years trying to develop, and he had it at 14, which told me something about what his father had been and what those hard years since had made of the boy. We lost one afternoon to breakout. A big red cow, one of the older ones who had decided she'd had enough of being directed and made for timber with 3 others following. We let them go, circled wide, got ahead of them, came back at a walk from the other direction, and by the time we had them turned and moving with the main group again, We'd lost 2 hours and my knee had registered its opinion of the afternoon loudly, and at length, I told the knee what I thought of its opinion and rode on. On the second afternoon, the swelling reached the point where the stirrup iron against it was genuinely not manageable, and I rode the last 4 hours with my right foot hanging free, which changes your balance and makes the horse uneasy because horses read weight, and when the weight is wrong they know it. I kept my hands steady on the reins and kept my upper body quiet, and told the horse with what I could control what I could not tell him with what I couldn't, and he settled for it. Good horse. I had kept him through the lean years, and he had been worth keeping. We came down the last grade in the early afternoon of the third day. 43 head, Emmett counted as they moved, which is what you do when you've come a long way for something, and you want to know exactly what you have. 43 Rockingham cattle, a decade wild, coming down the last slope with the reluctant energy of animals being moved somewhere not of their choosing, and then they saw the south pasture below, the grass, the water, the level ground, and the reluctance shifted. Cattle know pasture the way they know nothing else. It is in the oldest part of them, older than any 10 years in the high breaks. Nora had the gate open. She was at the south pasture gate with her hand on the wire, and she watched us come down with the expression of someone who had hoped for a thing and had not let themselves count on it. The cattle moved through the gate and Emmett counted heads as they went and called out 43, and she closed the gate behind the last one. I got down off the horse. My knee tried to buckle. I caught the stirrup fender, redistributed, found solid ground under me and stood. I was standing, working out the arithmetic of the pain when Nora walked over. Not to help, I was standing and she could see that. She put her hand on my forearm, a plain pressure like testing a post. Steady. You found them, she said. We found them. She shook her head once, not disagreeing, making a distinction that she felt was worth making. You found them, she said again. I didn't have an answer. I put my hand over hers on my arm. We stood there while Emmett saw to the horses, while the cattle spread into the south pasture grass, while the November light went flat and gold across a piece of ground that had not had cattle on it in 3 years. I have thought about that moment many times since. What I felt there. The closest I can get is this, the feeling of being in the right place doing the right thing with the right person beside you. A man feels that when he is young and treats it like weather, takes it for granted, assumes it will return. Then it goes, and he discovers that it does not simply return. You have to go somewhere to find it. You have to be willing to go somewhere. I had stopped being willing for 3 years. We worked the winter together. There is no clean way to explain the shape of those months. The cattle, the fences, the daily necessary work of getting a piece of land back to functional. The Rockingham brand had lapsed years back, the Callaway heirs gone south and uncontactable, the herd abandoned in every legal and practical sense, and the land office confirmed in December that by right of gather and the lapsing of the mark, they were mine. I had the paperwork in my hand and I held it for a long time, not from sentimentality, just from the fact of it. A decade of ghost herd talk, and here was a land office document saying 43 head, Rockingham brand, gathered from the eastern breaks of the county, owner of record, Callum Hart. I set it in the document drawer and went back to work. There was a great deal of work. The feral cattle needed gradual acclimatization to daily human contact. You cannot go from 10 years wild to being worked like domestic stock in a week, and you will injure animals and people trying. Emmett understood this with a naturalness that I found striking. He worked them in stages, presence first, then proximity, then contact, then handling, and at each stage he let the animals set the pace rather than pushing against their limit. It took most of November and all of December, and by the new year they were manageable. Not tame, these animals would never be what you'd call tame, and they'd pass that quality to their calves, which is not necessarily a bad thing in rangeland cattle, but manageable. Emmett worked cattle with a gift I have not often seen in a boy his age. Something in how he moved around a nervous animal, patient, economical, knowing when stillness was the right thing and when slow movement was. He had his father in him for that, clearly. I told him plainly that he had a gift for it, because there is no useful reason to leave a true thing unsaid to a boy who can use it. He took it the way he took most things: registered, filed, moved on. I paid him in wages. He took them without ceremony and gave most of them to his mother, which I knew because Nora mentioned it once and then never again. January was hard. Hard cold, hard wind, the kind of extended cold that is not weather but condition, the way some weeks in this country simply are and always will be, and the response to which is: stock wood, check your animals twice daily, keep your head down and wait it out. 2 of the feral cattle didn't winter through. Both old ones, the years in the high breaks having put a deficit in them that the mild seasons had masked. The rest held. The south pasture fence held. The barn roof held. The east well, which I fixed properly in early spring, new casing and a good pump, and a well man from town who actually knew what he was doing, held. The things I had built and maintained held. That sounds like a small thing, but it is not a small thing. For 3 years, the things I'd built had been going in one direction, going down, getting smaller. Now they were holding and in some places improving, and the direction of the change mattered more than the scale of it. Nora came to my kitchen table 2 mornings a week through January and February. Coffee, sometimes a meal. We talked about cattle, fences, the plans for spring, what to carry through the year, where the money would come from, what needed to be done first on the Carver parcel and what could wait. She was clear-eyed about money, and I respected that. A lot of people in hard circumstances develop a kind of magical thinking about money. They either avoid the subject or inflate what they have, and Nora was not that. She knew the number, she knew what the number meant, and she planned from it without drama. The 2 properties were running as one operation in everything but title, and neither of us was in a hurry about the title. We had both learned something about the cost of hurrying arrangements that are going well on their own terms. What I mean by that is, neither of us was in a rush to name what this was, because naming things prematurely has a way of reducing them to the size of the name. And what was between us was not small, and I did not want it reduced. I am 61 years old. I had been married once, and she died 12 years ago, and I had rearranged myself around that loss so gradually and so completely that I had stopped noticing the shape of the rearrangement. The way your body compensates for an injury over years until the compensation becomes the normal movement, and you forget there was another way. I had compensated for her absence until the absence was just how things were, which is not grief anymore, just the long, ordinary fact of a life with a piece missing. Nora had lost a husband 4 years ago and had spent the time since building someone who did not require anyone else to remain standing. That is a kind of strength that is quieter and harder than the kind that gets celebrated, not the dramatic strength of acting well under pressure, but the slow, ongoing strength of remaining functional when the ground has gone out from under you. I saw it in the way she drove the gray mule, in the way she worked cattle, the economy of it, nothing wasted, in the way she sat in a barn on a cold night and told a man a hard thing because she thought he needed to hear it, and then went back to her place and let him sit with it. We were not young. Neither of us was performing anything for the other. What was between us was quiet and daily and had weight to it, the kind of weight that accumulates from being in proximity to a person over months, from watching how they handle difficulty, from seeing them tired and cold and still working. That kind of weight is different from the light, urgent weight of something new. It is more like the weight of a good post, set deep and tamped solid. I did not want to rush it. I have rushed things in my life, and I know what that costs. I was content to let it be what it was for as long as it needed to be that. February came in cold and stayed cold, and I woke one morning to 6 inches of new snow and wind under the eaves. I went to the barn before breakfast, which I had always done in the years when things were working, and which I had stopped doing and which I had started doing again without marking the return. When I came back to the house, Nora's wagon was in the yard and Nora was in the kitchen. She'd started the coffee. She didn't explain why she was there on that particular cold morning. There was no explanation offered and none needed. She was there because she decided to be there, and that decision was the full account of it. Not need, she was not a needy woman. Not habit, not yet, though maybe heading there. She had decided on a cold morning with good snow on the ground that she wanted to be in that kitchen with that coffee, and she had come. She was at the stove with her back to me, pouring the coffee into 2 cups. I stood in the doorway with the cold still on my coat and the snow on my boots, and I looked at her. The set of her shoulders, the silver thread in her dark hair, the way she stood in a room not taking up space, not making herself small, just present, in the particular way of a person who knows where they are and has decided that's where they want to be. Something settled in me. I can't be more precise than that. Something that had been moving around loose for a long time stopped moving. "You stayed," I said. She turned and handed me the coffee. She looked at me for a moment with those gray eyes that give and hold in equal measure. "I don't know what made you think I was leaving," she said. She said it plain, the way she said everything, and went back to the stove. I sat down at the table with the coffee in my hands and the sound of the snow against the window, and the cattle settled somewhere out in the white of the south pasture. There is no adequate thing to say in that moment. I have thought about it since, and I cannot find one. What do you say to a woman who has looked at the real accounting of you, the bad knee, the blizzard year, the fence that went to ruin, the 3 years of going smaller, and looked at all of it clearly with those eyes that don't pretend, and has decided that it is not a reason to leave? There is no word made that carries that weight without spilling it. What I did was sit there and let the fact of it settle into me, the plain good weight of a thing that is true. I thought about the steer, standing in the frost in October with his ribs showing and one horn gone and the rocking-D iron on his hip, looking at me the way an animal looks when it has decided to make a judgment about you. I thought about the rifle, the tiredness with loss that had looked, for a moment, like a reason to add to it. I was glad I had been tired enough to lower it. By spring the operation was alive again. 51 head carrying the rocking-D iron in the south pasture, the east fence tight, the east well running clean, the Carver parcel fences standing. Emmett had grown 2 inches over winter and had begun rising before me, which I let pass without comment, because acknowledging it would have embarrassed him and cost me something too, and the work got done either way. The matter of title, of what the 2 properties and the 2 people who ran them were legally to each other, we have left for its own time. Neither of us is in a rush. What we have is real and doesn't require paperwork to be real, though the paperwork will come in its season, and it will say the same thing that is already true. Last evening I was at the south pasture fence. Light going long and gold, the way it goes in May when the days are still stretching out toward their longest, and the evenings have that particular quality of not wanting to end. The kind of light that makes a piece of land look like exactly what it is, which in my experience is different from how land usually looks. The herd was spread across the grass in the late warmth, quiet, unhurried, at ease in the way cattle are when they have come to trust a place over time. When the ground and the water and the daily patterns have become known and safe, the rocking-D cattle were indistinguishable from the others now, except by the brindle on their hides. They had settled in. The original stray, the one-horned brindle who had walked out of the arroyo that first October morning, was in the middle of the herd. He had a particular way of standing that I'd come to recognize, a kind of deliberate ease, like a large man who is comfortable enough to take up space. He looked like he'd always planned to be there. I expect he had. Nora came and stood beside me. We didn't say much. There wasn't much to say that the scene wasn't already saying better than either of us could. After a while she put her arm through mine, the way she does sometimes, not asking for anything, not signaling anything, just present. Her arm through mine and the cattle in the field and the May evening going slow and golden around us. I thought about the morning I almost raised the rifle. I think about it sometimes still. Not with regret. I made the right call, which was to make no call, to just lower the rifle and wait and see what the steer was going to do. But I think about how close it was. How close a man can come to the wrong thing through nothing worse than being tired and having run out of room to want what he wants. 51 head in the south pasture. A tight fence line. Good water. A boy who is going to be someone worth knowing. A good woman with her arm through mine in the evening light, who came in October with a gray mule and a month's ask, and who decided, in her own time and on her own terms, that this place and this man were worth staying for. That is the count. That is every part of it. That is enough.